This is an interview with historian Edward Thompson, who publishes as E.P. Thompson. Now, Edward is an exciting and controversial historian whose works have stimulated a tremendous amount of research and argument. But as well as being an eminent historian, he's also a polymath. That is to say, he's also a poet, a novelist, a man of letters, a political journalist, a peace campaigner, a socialist theoretician, and a left-wing political activist. Well, now, this should give us plenty to talk about, but I'd like to start with a rather simple question. Was there ever a moment that you thought, I'm going to become a historian, or did it emerge out of the other things you were doing?
Well, no, my first interest was always in literature, and I did, in fact, get a sort of a bursary to Cambridge, which was history, and read history there for a year before being called up. But even after the war, when I took my first job with the Workers' Educational Association, with the extramural department at Leeds, I was hired to teach both English and history. Now, I never had any formal sort of English degree, but I had done a tremendous amount of reading in this field. This was partly something that came from my family background. My father, who was a poet and historian and political activist of his own kind, I suppose I modelled myself partly on him, unconsciously. So I never took a decision to become a historian. What happened was that I was actually teaching English classes, extramural classes, and I wanted to find a good way of introducing those classes, and I thought, William Morris's writing on art and socialism, this kind of thing, would be very much what WA students would like to discuss. And when I got into it, I found that some of the misunderstandings about Morris were so dreadful, and then I became fascinated with the actual manuscripts in the archive, that they hooked me, and they made me a historian, that it was puzzling out the true record.
Well, there's lots of points I'd like to take up in that, Edward, but can we start out by hearing a bit more about your father and the sort of influence he had on you?
Yes, well, he had been a Wesleyan educational missionary in Bengal before the First World War and immediately afterwards. And then he left that, and he left the Methodist ministry, came back to England just before I was born. So I wasn't born in India, although my elder brother was. And he maintained a very close connection with India, both literary questions, he wrote 2 books on Rabindranath Tagore and had a very close association with Bengali cultural circles, and then this moved more widely. And by the 1930s, when I was becoming more politically conscious and aware, he was very sympathetic to the Indian Congress movement. And after 1935, he began to develop a most interesting friendship with Jawaharlal Nehru. There's some marvelous letters exchanged between them, including some when Nehru was in prison in the war. So that background was there all the time, and we had fascinating visitors during my childhood from India. On one occasion, there was Gandhi sitting in the corner of our house. I mainly remember that the sideboard was piled high with fruit and grapes. I mean, I was a small boy. But I did know that someone very distinguished was there. And this was part of the constant background. Right. And Nehru, you know, he visited us too. And he told me how to hold my cricket bat. And
So it's a background of literature and internationalism.
Yes.
And is there anything in the tradition of the sort of secularized dissent? Or
Yes, I mean, I was brought up with a quite proper, and I hope I passed it on to my children, quite proper belief that governments were mendacious always, and that weak government was much better than strong government. A sort of Whiggishness, which, or without the elitism of the Whiggishness, that is, my father joined the Labour Party in his last years, but he was really a radical liberal, and he was disgusted with the way the Labour Party never took the question of India seriously. So So, I mean, I think that a Whiggishness is extending across the world now. This resistance to the claim of the state to have all-embracing authority and power over the individual. This is being resisted, and I think that's quite right. Yes, I mean, yes, he was very actively engaged in the late 30s and in the war, campaigning on behalf of the Indian Congress movement and the Indian prisoners, and constantly going to conferences and meetings and so on, constantly writing in the papers. I regarded it as a sort of a normal state of life to be opposed to the powers that be.
So your later political activities and the peace campaign would come automatically out
It all
of that?
seemed natural, yes, as of nature, yes.
Yes, and the European context, particularly of the peace campaign, were important.
Very important, although those go back to the communist tradition. I mean, everything now is supposed to be rotten in the communist tradition. I don't think, although I departed from it very sharply in 1956, I don't think it all was all rotten. I mean, I think there was an authentic internationalism in it. You went to any country, you quickly found comrades, and very supportive comrades.
Yes, so this would also pick back to the experience of your brother, who died in Bulgaria. It was your first publication, was, I believe, the memoir of your brother.
Yes, that's right.
Because the notable thing about that memoir is the terrific optimism that was felt at the time.
Yes, I think I deluded myself about some things then. I didn't delude myself about the quality of enthusiasm that there still was in that country.
And was it were those experiences more important to you than actually your own wartime experiences? I mean, I've never heard you talk about those. I don't know what that entailed.
I'm afraid I have to confess that the war made a very deep impression on me. I still am a staunch anti-fascist of that vintage, and I never, I think, can get rid of that. So that I can never consider myself as being an absolute pacifist, a nuclear pacifist, of course, and I think that the state of the world is such that war is becoming increasingly impossible form of behavior, but I nevertheless can imagine situations in which I would not be a pacifist.
Mm. Which theatre of war were you actually in?
I was in Italy, a forgotten theatre of war. You never hear about it now. It wasn't a very sensible war. It was taking it slowly up that very long leg with ranges of mountains all the time, a tremendous series of defense positions that we had to go through.
So, a lot of big, important experiences early in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And then you took to WA classes.
It never occurred to me, and I don't think it ever occurred to Dorothy, that we would stay on at the university and, you know, doctorates and so on were not within our range of choice very much. It was a society with a lot of space in it after the war. There were a lot of spaces to be filled, so this was very encouraging. And having decided that adult education was the field I wanted to work in, as a number of people did at the time, I found it not very difficult to get a post, and went up and had these years in Yorkshire, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, where I learnt an awful lot from the students I taught, who were a very fine bunch of people.
What sort of thing would you say?
Well, I mean, if you talked about child labour or something like this, you found there were quite lively oral traditions, and also there was a skepticism about the official historical record, which was very valuable to meet groups and talk about it, because often skepticism was very well based. The books say that this and that date, this series of this legislation was passed on the hours of labour, and they'd tell you how the kids were put in baskets and hauled up to the ceiling whenever the inspectors were coming round. You know, I mean, they would have a lot of traditions of this sort.
Yes. Yes, and that was when you also found literature a natural part of teaching history.
Oh, yes, and I taught myself a lot of literature doing this. I mean, I really enjoyed teaching Shakespeare or teaching the Romantic poets, and I think I did it quite well. I think I lost the gift to teach like that when I came internal. You became so much more cautious in your teaching. I mean, probably some of the adult education teaching was a little bit loose. You know, you wanted to enthuse the class and give them a sense of the feeling and the movement of things, not the footnotes and the articles which they had to read, because they didn't have access to the learned journals. And when I went internal, you were like a grocer measuring out, you know, so much length, like measuring out the cheese or something of the articles and the reading they had to do and preparing it for them, and being quite sure that the different positions were put before them. So it became a different discipline.
Yes, I mean...
and I think you can see that in my writing too. I mean, I think the making, I think it's quite a fun book, but its documentation is not of the heavy scholarly character. The documentation isn't too bad, but I mean, if you contrast that with Customs in Common, I'm much more aware of this watching and sometimes hostile academic environment.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, I'd like to talk later on about the scholarly, the academic turn in your career, but if we go right back to the William Morris study, which you mentioned before, can you tell me about how that drew you into being a historian?
Well, yes, I think it was partly just partly a technical question, you know, that I used Morris's manuscripts a great deal, and I used the manuscripts of the Socialist League, which were in Amsterdam, and I remember my excitement going through these, and found out what extraordinary errors had been made in a number of the William Morris books that had been published, and got a kind of appetite for the archive. I think this is important. I don't think it's just a theoretical question. I think that the excitement of finding out as a historian things that people who lived through and were actors in these events didn't know themselves, you know, in a certain sense, a historian has a privileged viewpoint, more than the actors themselves. And I think this excitement hooked me, and this is what made me into a historian, really. I don't discount the importance of the archive and the technique at all.
Well, I mean, your account of the discovery of the Muggletonian archive is quite fascinating.
Well, yes, this was amazing. The Muggletonians, who'd been founded same time as the Quakers in 1650, continued in existence until this century. Indeed, the last Muggletonian died less than 10 years ago. And I had been trying to find these documents, which I knew had existed in the later 19th century. And I wrote an inquiry in a letter to the Times Literary Supplement. And a few days later, someone rang up and said, I've been in touch with someone whose father-in-law is the last Muggletonian. And so I was introduced, and Mr. Noakes was a retired fruit farmer down in Kent, and he was indeed, I think, the last Muggletonian. And he had been one of the last trustees in the time of the Second World War, and the meeting house, which still existed, had a firebomb in it, and the caretaker decided she couldn't live there anymore. So Mr. Noakes took a lorry load of apples into Covent Garden Market and went round to the meeting house when he'd unloaded his apples with the boxes and filled the apple boxes up with all the Muggletonian archive. And he took it back to his home in Kent, where another bomb descended, and he put most of the archive into a furniture repository. And there he and I inspected it together.
Can we go back to this question of early intellectual influences? Were there any other writers or thinkers who influenced you in your younger days?
I was very excited by Christopher Hill's little book, 1640, and I think I still have a paper on the materialist conception of history, which I gave the School History Society when I was, I suppose, just 16. The role of the individual in history and so on, which I took very seriously, the sort of thing one would do at 16. Well, I was terribly excited by Puritanism and liberty, the Putney debates, and so on, and this authentic, rich primary material was absolutely splendid to have. But I think I probably regarded myself then as more of a literary person than a historian, and one book which influenced me still at school quite a lot was Christopher Caldwell's Studies in a Dying Culture. And I suppose I was reasonably well taught at school. I wasn't at Cambridge when I went up. I think the less said about that, the better. I don't want to say too injurious things, but my first tutor, my first year, was Kenneth Pickthorne, a Tory MP. And I remember took trembling into him my first, essay. And he said, throw it away, look at that carpet. I can just about see a pattern in it. And when you've been doing history for 40 years, you'll begin to see a pattern. Don't come here with ready-made patterns.
I did want to ask, you have a very distinctive, energetic, dynamic writing style. Did you develop this consciously, or is it something that emerged from your personality, as it were?
Well, probably the second more than the first, but I do always, when I'm approaching a piece of paper and a typewriter, very carefully consider how to express a particular issue. I think it's very important. I've always thought that history should be for a general public as well as for specialists, although I think rather less now than I used to.
Sorry, why less now than you
I think this
used to?
This happened because I became rather notorious and became an object of criticism, and so became more self-conscious of the received academic standards and more aware that people were watching me, and therefore I began to write more for that public than for the sort of WA public, or Penguin public. And I mean, I don't in any sense disparage high and precise standards of scholarship. I don't disparage this at all. So I'm not complaining about this, but I do think that some of what I do now is more boring.
Well, picking up the other theme, not just on style, but also subjects, what has brought you to study one particular subject or theme?
It's an awful lot of happenstance, and I think it's quite disgraceful. Sort of no proper planning, no Foucault type running through the sequence of human functions and capacities. I got into the making of the English working class because I was broke, and someone, a publisher, offered a contract, I think paid me £50 on signature, for a history of the British working class movement from, from about 1800 to about 1945 or something. And the making is the first chapter of this.
Yes.
But I never imagined when I set out on that book that it was going to be only till 1830 and so long and so full.
And then that, of course, tied you into certain 18th century debates as well as 19th century debates.
Well, yes. I mean, I haven't finished with them yet. I mean, if I am given enough time, I might return to the 1790s. I still think it's an absolutely fascinating decade in British history. It's about the only decade between the 1640s and 50s, and people might make some claim for, say, bits of the 1930s or the 1960s, when you've had a really radical bourgeoisie in this country. I mean, authentically radical bourgeoisie in this country. And I think it's been generally underestimated and been put down a good deal in orthodox academe. I mean, there's a great deal of attention to Wollstonecraft now, but rather little understanding that she wasn't just an isolated figure, that there was quite a lot of a sisterhood around her, who, alas, suffered in her defeat.
Yes, I mean, there was a sense of closure in those radical circles by the end of the decade.
Absolutely, you can absolutely date it, about 1798. I mean, the counterattack becomes so heavy and oppressive. That's, you know, intellectuals were sort of leaving the country in large numbers, either to America or, like Coleridge and Wordsworth, hopped across to Germany for a couple of years to get out from under.
Yes, and do you think the loss of this radical bourgeoisie was actually a loss to the radical movement that followed?
Yes, I think there was there followed a dissociation between the radical intelligentsia and the very sturdy working class movement, sometimes coming out of an underground. They didn't really have much dialogue with each other, and the opportunities for dialogue were lost.
Anyway, going back to this question of the development of your career, you mentioned before, enticingly, that you saw the move to Warwick as something of an academic turn. What importance do you attach to that and the creation of the Centre for Social History?
I think it was quite rewarding for me in some respects. I mean, I enjoyed the teaching, and I also became more systematic in my reading. I mean, I kept up much more with the learned journals than I had done. As an extramural tutor, one wasn't close enough to a library to do this always, and nor did the classes necessarily want to know what the latest articles were saying.
And did you see it as setting up something as conscious as a school of thought, or was it more a common approach?
No, I never wanted to lean on the graduates so as to induce them into a Thompsonian frame of reference. I don't think a teacher should do that. Maybe it's the English refusal to do it. I mean, obviously in France, in Paris, or in Germany, this is done. I prefer the English way, in which the definitions and initiatives are left with the graduates themselves, but a certain style of work in the seminar was certainly developed, and a great deal of cooperation and exchange.
But eventually you found the university framework confining?
Well, this is partly a personal situation. That it's sometimes thought that I left Warwick because of the great bust-up at Warwick, but I had various other reasons. I wasn't getting any of my writing done. I mean, the teaching was so heavy, the work of the graduate school was so heavy.
Another area I'd like to talk about is Marxism, developments within Marxism and the Marxist approach to history. Mm-hmm. And would you define yourself simply as a Marxist?
Well, no, I have refused that. In some of the things I wrote in Poverty Theory, for example, I now don't accept the notion of Marxism as a self-validating, ultimately having an essential self-validating core which validates all the rest as a system. I think that is a religious attitude. I think that, I'm talking about now, I think that there is a Marxist tradition, which is an international tradition, and which has a vocabulary of concepts which have been carefully worked through, and around which a lot of work has been supported, and that one can select from this tradition as one chooses. I suppose I don't like the phrase at all, but I suppose I'm a kind of post-Marxist. It depends who I'm talking to. When I'm talking to severe anti-Marxists, this tends to push me back onto the Marxist rails. When I'm talking with dogmatic Marxists, it pushes me off the rails straight away. But the interesting thing is, when I started, in the Second World War at Cambridge, people were not Marxists so much as communists. They were very committed to a political movement, anti-fascist political movement, and Marxism was rather more obscure and intellectual form. There were classes in Marxism, but you had to be a hell of an intellectual to sort of really take the measure of these. So it's from the 60s onwards that the shift took place from a political commitment primarily to an intellectual commitment to a particular kind of intellectual formation.
And would you say that you yourself had moved from, what would you describe as the religious belief in Marxism, to a more dialectical position?
I have a great respect for the Marxist tradition, for some of its achievements and some of the things it opened up, but I get absolutely bored with endless discussions of Marxism now. I just think that when they became theory with a capital T, this was something I rejected. I wrote this out with some care and quite fully in The Poverty of Theory, and actually said that one had come to a crossroads, and that it's not only a question of an inclination to reject the religious forms of Marxism, but an absolute necessity, because it was a form of irrationalism which had to be rejected. And I still hold that, yes.
But when did that transition in your own thought occur? Presumably before you...
In a series of polemics. You see, the making, in a curious way, was a polemic, a two-faced polemic, facing two ways, both of orthodox economic quantitative history and orthodox dogmatic Marxism. The notion that given steam mills, if this would process a given number of proletarians and form their consciousness. And as against that, I was polemicizing in terms of the self-activity of working people and also the authenticity of intellectual traditions, some of them predating the steam mill, some of them coming down from the 18th century. I have the view that theory can take the form of critique and polemic rather than the building of theoretical structures which are abstracted from critique and abstracted from empirical research. I think this is the abomination that maketh desolate, It's precisely the abstraction that I rebel against. And I think that actually in Marx and Engels' own practice, quite a lot of their theoretical developments were in the form of critique and polemic. And that involves a different attitude to theory, that you have to be alert to the assumptions that are being smuggled in at every stage. And I think that also means that one ought to read fairly widely in other disciplines and be aware of what the theoretical innovations of anthropology and sociology and so on, and be rather cautious of them sometimes, not take them over wholesale.
Yes, I mean, the British tradition of studying history, though, surely, if anything, has erred massively on the side of empiricism rather than too much theory.
Well, I have to regret to confess that I am a bit British myself. I think, particularly when I encounter the forms of theory developed by Foucault, more by Derrida or some other characters one could name, I return howling to empiricism, which I think has great strength in some ways. But I think it has to be theoretically informed empiricism. Definitely. I mean, sheer vacant empiricism is a gathering ground for all kinds of unstated theory, all kinds of unstated theory.
I mean, if we come on to some of the modern theoretical debates, there's a strong element of theory in some of the new feminisms, feminist history, and some of those have criticised your work. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Yes, well, I have become a sort of non-person among some radical American feminists, supposedly for my total neglect of women in the making of the English working class. I think it's partly an unfair critique, because there are quite a lot of women in it, and I wouldn't have been allowed to get away with no women at all by Dorothy, who was reading it all. There is a technical problem that when you're in a period in which the actual institutions and the records that come with those institutions are almost exclusively male, that is, the early trade unions or the London corresponding societies and other corresponding societies, these are pretty well male. Inevitably, the history you write is going to be influenced by this. However, I think that Joan Scott made one important, and she wasn't the only person, made one important critique of the making, which I ought to bear in mind, which is that working class itself was a male structure, was a male construct in many ways. And I don't think I'd seen that clearly, and I think she's clearly shown that the first working class institutions, the very construction of class and class consciousness had male notations throughout. And if the historian is not aware of this, and I'm very glad that historians are now aware of it, you get a false reading.
One of the themes we haven't talked about yet, Edward, is your interest in American scholarship and your period's teaching in the States. How important were those to you in your intellectual trajectory?
This really has been very important to me in the last 20 years, at least the last 20 years. I think I first went to... There's a long separation of American and European radicals because of McCarthyism. Anyway, this came to an end, I think, for me in, I think, 1965, when I was invited by Herbert Gutman, to teach for a while at Buffalo. That was the beginning of a succession of invitations, and some of these visits were extremely stimulating because on an American faculty you had a very wide range of specialists, and I think more innovative than in Britain, although on our last visit or two I haven't felt that quite as much. I think they're getting a little bit of the British disease too.
Meaning what by the British disease?
Well, no, the one thing that is not particularly British, that can be good, but sometimes is a bit too much, is the fads and fashions, the rapidity which exists in the United States. Fashions develop and immediately form new centres, centres for this and that. And
yes.
They've also got a lot of French flu at the moment. The tremendous amount of deconstructionist rubbish that is mulled over in seminars.
But what are the positive elements in the American style and historical tradition?
Well, I think there is a authentic intellectual radicalism, a willingness to search and pursue into innovative areas, and a toughness among some of them about civil rights, racism, women's issues, which is very invigorating.
So this brings us on to the theme of also some of the continuities in radical traditions, which, well, it's something you've been talking about in many ways. And how does that influence recent work you've been doing on the poet William Blake?
I've been trying to burrow away and tunnel away back from Blake to Christopher Hill and A.L. Morton's territory, the radicals of the 1650 period, and try and trace what continuities there might be, what vectors there might be of this antinomian tradition through to Blake's time, because Blake so evidently has the vocabulary and imagery which is reminiscent of the ranters and so on. So this is again sort of an attempt to connect that work that Christopher Hill and others have done with the late 18th century. So half of the book is about all this. Mm-hmm. I think that one can't really study Blake unless one takes his highly unorthodox and in some ways eccentric religious beliefs seriously. I mean, I think that what he is, Blake is refusing the deist rationalism. He's refusing the Lockean epistemology. He doesn't believe that's acceptable, so that he can't become a deist in that sense, but he has profound political sympathy with the Tom Paynites. But what he says is, if you still have a psychology which is based upon the notion that self-interest is the primary explanation of human behavior, then you never can get out of the trap of self-interest, and you have to find some way of affirming thou shalt love, and he can't do that without Christian vocabulary.
Yes, well, I suppose that's a problem for modern radicalism.
I think it is. That's why I think it's so alive, yes. Yes. Mm.
And in terms of approach to history, then, this brings us back to the question of consciousness, which you've emphasised throughout, in a sense that the Marxism or developments from Marxism that you've propounded have always been alert to this question of consciousness rather than simply structures. I mean, would you say that was, as it were, the message? Or is that putting it too crudely?
No, I think the message is remains self-activity, that human beings are agents, albeit very limited agents and often overcome by determinations, that they are agents in the making of their own history. That relates to consciousness, yes, certainly. But consciousness is never automatic. I mean, it is constructed. It is made, and it is made by self-activity.
Just on the question of definitions, you used the phrase history from below. Is that a totally good description of what you think your a fellowship were propounding? Because in some ways, in the making, for example, or in Whigs and Hunters, you're actually very interested in power structures from above as well.
Absolutely true, yes, absolutely true. And although the making of the English working class is more about impulses from below, I was indebted to a great deal of writing and thought by other historians who looked at the structures of the Industrial Revolution, the structures of capitalism in this period of growth.
Can I end, Edward, by asking a rather generalised question with reference to the current state of history? Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist?
I think I'm probably a modest optimist. Well, I think both in the United States and in Britain, which are the places I know best, university historians have been going through a pretty bad patch, partly because of direct things like cuts and productivity expectations and so on. And this has led to much less space for innovation and for the kind of inventive and stimulating atmosphere which was felt in the 60s. So in that sense, it's a somewhat pessimistic position. But I don't think that's an irreversible one. I don't see why it should be irreversible at all. After all, governments can change, funding of universities can change, and I hope that university faculty can maintain a control over their own conditions and spaces and not be pushed around by administrators.
And presumably, too, going back to the much earlier point you were making, some of this renovation should be coming from outside the academy as well. It's not just a process within.
That's true. I mean, I think that in a certain sense, some of the regaining of women's presence in history, which I'm sure has taken place, although I'm critical of some American feminism, is presenting a new agenda, which is a hopeful and interesting agenda. It's not necessarily coterminous with feminism. I mean, I think the curious way, the emphasis upon the women's presence is felt very generally now in historiography, whereas some rather committed feminist history has gone and hived itself off into another space and taken itself out of the mainstream of history, which I think is very sad. However, I think there are hopeful signs of a more all-inclusive historical concern, taking in the family, feminist issues or women's issues, and taking in a wider understanding of the history of ideas than there used to be.
Well, and that's a note of qualified optimism, which is a good point on which to end. Edward Thompson, thank you very much.
Thank you.